So today what we're going to be working on is graphing sine and cosine functions with horizontal shifts. So the try this says to identify the parts, and so you're identifying the parts of the sine and the sine function, whether it's sine or cosine. So put me on pause, identify the parts, and then come back and check your answers. Okay, so for the first one we have y equals a sine b times x plus minus c plus d. So we have here a is the amplitude. So we have the amplitude is equal to the absolute value of a. The number of cycles is equal to b. We also have the midline is y equals d. And then we have, now remember, the midline is, your midline is your vertical shift. Okay, and then we have C. C is what's called your phase shift. So that's your C. And remember, since we're adding or subtracting from x, it goes opposite the way you think it goes. So this is called your horizontal shift. That's your left and right. We're adding to x, goes left and right. All right, and on the other side, we have y equals d plus a sine b times x plus minus c. So the same thing, we have your amplitude is a, the absolute value of a, actually. We have the number of cycles is b. And we have the midline is y equals d. Now, I just wrote it at the beginning, but it's still d. Okay, because it's d plus. So remember, that's your shift that goes up and down. And then we have the phase shift. That's your plus minus c. So remember, if it's plus c, it goes to the left. If it's minus c, it goes to the right. That's called your phase shift, horizontal shift. All right, so let's take a look at the first problem. Okay, so for the first problem, we're graphing y equals x plus pi over 2, and we're graphing in the interval from 0 to 2 pi. So let's identify some of the features that we need to graph. So we have the amplitude is equal to 1, absolute value of 1, which is 1. The number of cycles is 1 cycle. The period is 2 pi over b, so that's just 2 pi. The number of slashes is 4 times b, which 4 times 1 is 4. Your x scale is 2 pi over the number of slashes, which is going to be 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Your midline is y equals 0 because we're not adding or subtracting anything to the function. Okay, your range. So you're going from the midline down 1 unit, that's -1. And the midline up 1 unit is 1. All right, and now your phase shift, which is the new piece. So this is your phase shift in here. So we are going to the left, pi over 2. So it's a positive pi over 2, so that means it's to the left pi over 2. All right, so we're going to start by graphing. And we're going to we are graphing from 1 to -1. So we have 1 to -1. We're going from 1 to -1. I need 4 slashes, and I'll tell you what we're going to do with the shift in a minute. 1, 2, 3, 4. The first one is going to be pi over 2, and then pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. All right, so notice that our shift is to the left, pi over 2, and that's my interval. All right, so notice my interval here is pi over 2. So I want to go to the left by pi over 2. So I go to the left, negative pi over 2. So it is a sine function. So normally we would start here, our sine function here. But since we're shifting to the left, I have to, instead of starting here, I have to start here. And it's a sine, so it's going to go up. So it's going to go up to here, to 1, down, down, back to here, and then up, and it'll look like this. So now, since it says to graph, to show your graph in the interval from 0 to 2 pi, right now my graph is shown from negative pi over 2 to 2 pi, so that's too much. So what I want you to do is just box off the interval that you want me to see. So that's kind of like circling your answer. Okay, and then the last thing I want you to be able to do is write down the interval where you see one complete curve. So the easiest thing to do is you take what's inside the parentheses here. So what's inside the parentheses is x plus pi over 2. You set it equal to 0. And x plus pi over 2, and you set it equal to 2 pi, and you solve for x. And this will give you the interval where you see one complete cycle. So minus pi over 2, you get x is equal to negative pi over 2, minus pi over 2. So just in your calculator, do 2 minus 1/2, and you get x is equal to 3 pi over 2. So your interval is from negative pi over 2 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 3 pi over 2. Okay, so let's flip it over and try the two problems that are on the back. Okay, so let's take a look at the next one, which is y equals cosine 3 times x minus pi over 6, and I'm graphing in the interval from 0 to 2 pi. Notice that the b is on the outside. B should always be on the outside, never on the inside with the x, always on the outside. All right, so let's start identifying the amplitude. So the amplitude is 1. The number of cycles is 3. The period is 2 pi over 3. The number of slashes is 4 times 3, which is 12. The x scale is 2 pi over 12, which is pi over 6. Your midline is still y equals 0. Your range is from negative 1 to 1. All right, now your phase shift. Your phase shift, right, so I have a minus pi over 6 is to the right by pi over 6. And you would actually say to the right pi over 6. You won't just say pi over 6. You say to the right pi over 6. That's the phase shift. All right, so we are graphing from 0 to 2 pi. So I'm going to start by putting down my 12 slashes. All right, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so start labeling them. Pi over 6. I'm just going to try to change the size here. So I have pi over 6, 2 pi over 6. That's a 2 pi over 6. We have 3 pi over 6, 4 pi over 6, so you can reduce them if you want, 5 pi over 6, 6 pi over 6 is pi, 7 pi over 6, 8 pi over 6, 9 pi over 6, 10 pi over 6, 11 pi over 6, and 2 pi at the end. All right, and we are going up and down to 1. So we have 1 and negative 1. Okay, so we are shifting to the right by pi over 6. So I'm not going to start. Normally I would start my cosine function. I would actually start it here. But since I'm shifting to the right pi over 6, I'm going to start here on this slash mark. That's going to actually be my first point. Okay, so not this here. Okay, so that red dot should not be there now. All right, so I shifted to the right pi over 6. So we're at our max, so we're going to come down to the midline, min, midline, max, midline, min, midline, max, midline, min, and midline. Okay, so it's going to look like this. So notice that I did not start on the y-axis. Okay, but however, I am graphing, it says to graph from 0 to 2 pi. Right now, I didn't start from 0. So I actually have to extend my graph over to, if I'm at my max, it would be over here at 0. So I have to extend my graph here. So it should look like this now. Okay, because I am graphing from 0 to 2 pi. Okay, so now we're going to find our endpoints. Now, when we find our endpoints for one interval, I'm just going to get rid of this here. All right, when I find the endpoints for one interval, you actually have to take the 3 that's on the outside and actually distribute it on the inside. So we're really dealing with y equals cosine 3x minus 3 pi over 6. All right, so you're going to take that 3x minus 3 pi over 6 equals 0. And remember, the other one is 3x minus 3 pi over 6 equals 2 pi. And you solve it. All right, so I add 3 pi over 6. I get 3 equals 3 pi over 6. Divide by 3, and I get pi over 6. And on the other side, I get 3x equals, add 3 pi over 6. So I get 5 pi over 2. And then divide by 3. And I get 5 pi over 6. So you can see that in here. If I'm starting at pi over 6, I'll have one interval in here, in this piece in here. So my interval is from pi over 6 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to 5 pi over 6. Okay, so let's try the last one. Okay, so for the last one, notice that, well, first the equation is y equals 3 sine, and then in the parentheses I have 2x plus pi over 2. So you actually have to factor out this 2 here so that you can tell what the phase shift is. All right, so we have to have y equals 3 sine. So you're going to GCF out the 2. We have x plus, that's going to be pi over 4 minus 3. And we're graphing from negative pi to pi here. Okay, so let's write down our information. I have an amplitude of 3. The number of cycles is 2. The period is 2 pi over 2, which is pi. The number of slashes is 4 times 2, which is 8. Your x scale is 2 pi over 8, which is pi over 4. Your midline is going to be y equals negative 3. Okay, your range. So we're going from negative 3. Negative 3 down 3 units puts me at negative 6. And negative 3 up 3 units puts me at 0. And the phase shift, which is right here, is going to be to the left, pi over 4. Okay, so let's graph. Now remember, I'm graphing from negative pi to pi. Okay, so I have 8 slashes. That means 4 on each side. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I have pi over 4 is my scale. 2 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4 pi. Negative pi over 4. Negative 2 pi over 4. Negative 3 pi over 4. Negative pi. So I'm shifting, I have a shift down of 3 units, so that's my midline is at negative 3. So I'm going to put that dotted line in there. We are going up to 0, so we're going up to 0 and down to negative 6. Okay, so now it is a sine curve, so normally what I would do is I would start my sine curve at my midline right here. But I'm shifting to the left pi over 4 units. So I actually have to start right here. So this should still be red there and black here. All right, so I'm starting here, and then it's going to go up to my max because I'm at my midline, down to my midline, my min, midline, max. So I have this side here. And I'm at my midline, so I'm going to continue down to my min, midline, and max. So it looks like this. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to graph from negative pi to positive pi. So that's my graph in here. And now I just have to find the interval for one complete cycle. So I take y equals 3 sine 2x plus pi over 2 minus 3. And I take what's inside because the 2 is already distributed. So I have 2x plus pi over 2 equals 0. And 2x plus pi over 2 equals 2 pi. All right, so we are going to minus pi over 2. I get 2x equals pi over 2. Divide by 2, and I get pi is equal to 1/4. Sorry, that is negative 1/4 because this should be a negative. Okay, and same thing over here. I have 2x equals minus pi over 2. So you're going to do 2 minus a half. And when you do 2 minus a half, put that back into a fraction. It's 3 pi over 2. And then divide both sides by 2, and you get 3 pi over 4. So my interval would be from negative pi over 4 is less than or equal to x, is less than or equal to 3 pi over 4. Okay, so that's it, and we'll practice in class tomorrow. Everyone have a good night.